Hello and good evening, I'm Melisa Idris.
I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Now, you may notice that tonight's show looks a little bit different. That's because Sharaad and I were both primary contacts to a positive COVID-19 case, and therefore we're both self-isolating and working from home. So we're not in AWANI studios at the moment, but we're trying to put together a show for you from our respective living rooms. And today's news of the emergency being declared is far too important to miss discussing on the show. So we have joining us tonight prominent economist and former senior UN official Jomo Kwame Sundaram. Jomo, good evening. Welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Now, do you think that a state of emergency is warranted now, today, compared to, say, a couple of months ago, back in October, when the bid for emergency rule was then denied?
I think a state of emergency was not warranted in both circumstances, but for slightly different reasons. I think we had an MCO announced last evening, and that MCO would actually be quite adequate given the way the government has defined the problem. However, it is my belief that it is quite possible to better handle the COVID-19 epidemic in this country without resorting to nationwide, or at least part of the nationwide shelter lockdown. There have been demonstrated a much more effective way of dealing with COVID-19, particularly in East Asia, and even in countries such as Vietnam, Laos, and even arguably Thailand, and of course in Kerala in southwestern India.
Jomo, is this then simply the politics of self-preservation working itself out? I mean, after all, the Prime Minister, Muhyiddin Yassin, lost his parliamentary majority just a few days ago, and after weeks of threats from UMNO, which is in many ways his cornerstone party support within Parliament. Is that what's working its way working itself out today?
Well, I cannot really speculate because I'm not privy to a lot of information which is relevant. But this is how it is being perceived by many people, not only in the chattering classes, but even by ordinary people. They see the situation as one of largely of preservation. If we refer back to the other emergency declarations in the history of independent Malaya and then Malaysia, even then we find that they did not involve the suspension of parliament in at least 2 or 3 cases. If you think, and the Prime Minister was cited the Privy Council case, but of course we know that before that Parliament was convened in 1959 after the first general election in independent Malaya, and then subsequently, of course, despite the confrontasi with Indonesia, there was Parliament continued to be convened in 1964. So that in and of itself is not necessarily an indication of the need for the suspension of Parliament. Suspension of Parliament and the question of an emergency are different issues, and they have been combined, understandably, by the incumbent government for reasons which I think most people presume they know.
Well, Jomo, I want to ask you, your thoughts on one of the reasons that the Prime Minister gave for declaring this emergency was so that the private sector could be co-opted into the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic with emergency ordinances. Now, I know countries like Spain and Ireland in the early days of the pandemic when cases were spiking, they all nationalized hospitals to battle the pandemic. Now, do you think that this is the right move for Malaysia to use emergency ordinances to co-opt private sector assets?
Well, I think the situation seems to be quite dire in some parts of the country, and there may well be the need to take over and cooperate with the owners of these privatized health facilities to better deal with the crisis. I do think that we have long been advocating an all-of-government approach and a whole-of-society approach. And this is absolutely necessary. But that in and of itself is no reason why you need an emergency declaration. There have been many instances in the past in many societies, and even in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, private facilities have been followed. For example, the situation in Argentina and other places, and this has happened in many instances all over the world without a declaration of a state of emergency.
In listening to what the Prime Minister's address, do you see any hint of the government recalibrating its approach to the pandemic, addressing policy blind spots, increasing testing and so on? We recently had, over 40 public health officials, in an open letter to the Prime Minister urging a recalibration, a re-strategizing. Do you see any of that in the recent pronouncements?
Well, I think as you hosted a session with Minister Khairi Jamaluddin last week, at the end of last week, and in that session he indicated a certain openness to many of the suggestions in the memorandum signed by 46 people, 44 of whom were doctors and others involved in public health. I should emphasize that I'm probably the only non-health related official in there, although I have done some work on health issues in the past. And in fact continue to have a very active interest in COVID-19, not only in Malaysia but also all over the world. I think what is very clear is that there is a need for calibration. I think it would be wrong and unfair to describe the current measures as simply a continuation of the past. But I think where the disagreement is over the nature of the measures and over the efficacy of those measures. And for instance, there have been many developments all over the world which we can learn from. And also, very importantly, there are new tests which have been developed, and these tests have been found to be quite efficacious. But more importantly, they are also much cheaper. For example, the test of using antigens on antigens as opposed to antibodies is a big, major step forward. It allows almost immediate diagnosis and assessment, and this means early action because, as we know, there are many people all over the world who do not necessarily show any symptoms, but they may well be infected as well as infectious. So it is very important that we realize all these problems which we have in dealing with this, and not rely on a sort of, the vaccine is going to solve all our problems kind of approach.
Well, I mean, in that letter, in that open letter to the Prime Minister, you and the others that undersigned it, gave 10 really, I think really important and urgent, critical proposals to deal with the pandemic. I am struggling, Jomo, to understand where this emergency comes in. How does this emergency help us deal with the current pandemic?
I think you would have to ask the spokesman, the Prime Minister's spokesman, to answer that persuasively. I think most people are to try to rationalize that. Most people recognize that there is a public health emergency. Most people also recognize that there was some progress in the early weeks and months, but that the situation has regressed. And part of the problem, of course, is a sort of a reliance on state shelter lockdowns and not enough testing, not enough contact tracing, and inadequate measures to deal and contain the contagion. It is challenging, undoubtedly, and I think it is the intention of the 46 to try to improve policy, and it's not the intention of the 46 signatories of the letter to undermine public health efforts to deal with the situation.
Jomo, the Prime Minister in his address was at pains to kind of paint this as a special type of emergency. In previous iterations, there was this talk about a health emergency, and today we hear it's an administrative emergency, not military-style emergency, and so on and so forth. But what is the consequence for the country of any kind of emergency of this sort? I mean, does it augur well for confidence in the country and its economy? How do you think this is going to be read?
It's difficult to tell. It's difficult to tell because, as you know, some countries have done far worse. Some so-called developed countries like the US and the UK have fared much, much worse than we have. But I think that is a very, very low bar to compare ourselves against when we consider that our East Asian neighbors have generally done much better, leaving aside, of course, the island countries in the region. But if we think about Japan, we think about Korea, we think about Taiwan province, we think about China itself, and besides Vietnam and Laos and so on, I think there's a lot which we should learn from them about how they have contained the situation. Unfortunately, we are not doing that. There are also some own goals, as I put it. For example, the Singapore second wave, so-called second wave, was mainly due to foreign workers. And this was something which was so obvious, given that a former human resources minister had estimated about 6.7 million people in the workforce. 6.7 foreigners in the workforce, 2/3 of whom are basically undocumented. So when you basically refuse to test them, which was a signal which was sent by early on, and I want to emphasize that MOH had a very different view of this. So there are differences within government, but there were those who didn't want to test them, and also did not address the problem, the various problems which they face. So herding them into barbed wired settlements and so on and so forth is hardly a solution. Nobody is going to come forward to be herded into such conditions and be treated basically as criminal elements. So you really needed a much more nuanced kind of approach. And this, I think, was unfortunately not adopted. So we basically lost about almost half a year carrying on with our sort of slightly semi-repressive types of approach to that. But I think that the key question now is to switch to a much cheaper and faster and almost as accurate method of testing, which would basically enable a great deal more people to be tested. And sometimes there will be the need for repeat testing, because just because you're not infected, say, a month ago, doesn't mean you may not be infected in the interim. So a lot needs to be done. I do hope that the Prime Minister and his team will look at this, but I think there is a need for an all-of-government approach and a whole-of-society approach. And this, too, we have been emphasizing since about 9 months ago. And unfortunately, there is only partial evidence of the adoption of such an approach. So I think...
Jomo, very quickly, are you confident that we will not waste the months that we are now trying to buy through an emergency plus MCO approach? Do you think we will waste it yet again?
It remains to be seen. I mean, I think one has to recognize that there have been some improvements, although there have been also important steps backwards. If you look, for example, at the, announcing national numbers, basically does not tell us very much about the situation on the West Coast, in the major urban conurbations in the West Coast. We really need a much more nuanced kind of approach. And, in Vietnam, for example, you had approaches where, particular neighborhoods, particular communes, as they call them, were basically isolated. And there was never a national or even a Hanoi-wide or a Ho Chi Minh City-wide stay in shelter lockdown. So always a much more targeted approach would be far more effective. But you really need to get everybody involved, including migrant workers, who are often very poorly treated in our society, very unfortunately. But if without their goodwill and their cooperation, I'm afraid we are going to have, it's going to be one step forward, one step back, and sometimes two steps backward.
Jomo, thank you so much for joining us on the show tonight. We really do appreciate your time and you sharing your insights with us. We're going to take a quick break here on Consider This, but we will be back with more, so stay tuned.
Hi, thanks so much for staying with Sharaad and I on Consider This. This is the home quarantine self-isolation edition of Consider This. Let's continue our conversation about the emergency proclamation that was announced today. It was effective yesterday and expected to last at least until August 1st. Now, joining us on the line, we have Tricia Yeoh, the CEO of the think tank Ideas, or Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs. Tricia, good evening. Now, why do you think this emergency was granted when the previous bid in October last year was denied? I mean, are we losing the fight against COVID-19 currently that we need to resort to this particular form of a state of emergency?
Hi, Melissa and Sharaad. Thanks for having me on. So the answer is simply that I think this time I can't speak on behalf of the king, of course, so I think I should caveat that in the first instance. But I think, one possibility is that he may be perhaps wanting to avoid a similar situation in which he had to personally meet all the MPs last year when there was a loss of confidence in one prime minister, and then he had to make that determination about who the next prime minister was. And perhaps the risk is higher now, given that there are cabinet ministers who already have been tested positive, and that kind of decision-making process, of course, is very difficult. And maybe that's not something that he wanted to do at this point in time. The second possibility, of course, is that we know the vaccinations have been announced as arriving on our shores and being rolled out as soon as February next month. And there is a possibility that he would have maybe wanted the vaccinations to be rolled out, and then at that point in time have this independent bipartisan committee that the Prime Minister has announced will be formed to make that decision when it is safe to have an election. But this is really not something that we know about. Of course, we know that there could have been alternative solutions to calling an emergency, because we know that essentially it's not just for the public health reasons that the Prime Minister has said it is for. We know that it is the combined factors of the COVID-19 pandemic as well as the political impasse that the government is currently facing.
Tricia, do you worry that there are elements in what has been announced that suggest that the government might have to resort to forcing, the political elite, and maybe not just the political elite, maybe the media as well, to toe the line, that there's in fact a chilling effect by calling an emergency, one that will use the public health crisis as a way of imposing political control?
I think there's definitely that concern there. So this announcement seems a little bit, it's inconsistent on different levels, right? Because on the one hand, it's trying to take the approach that, don't worry about it. This is an administrative emergency. Government services are carrying on as usual. actually under the MCO, if you look at the list of essential services that are allowed to operate, the list is quite long, right? So you actually ask yourself the question, which are the ones that are not allowed to operate? But anyway, so the point is that the government has had, like, on the one hand, a very, things are actually as usual. The rakyat can go out and go about their business, never mind that also there's the MCO going on. But on the other hand, I think in the same fell swoop, the government and the Prime Minister in his speech also said that action will be taken if there are certain things that you do that will go against what the MCO entails and what the government is trying to do to manage the pandemic. So I think the fact that it's being called an emergency, an emergency is an emergency, whatever you want to call it, if it's an administrative emergency or not. The Constitution only recognizes as such that the emergency exists in the form of Article 150 of the Federal Constitution, and there will be ramifications there. So I think you're right that chilling effect certainly has taken effect. Those who are within civil society or media or even opposition politicians, I think that is the intended effect, and that would have happened already. Because, like I said, ultimately what the emergency is that Parliament will be suspended. So we know that much.
Yeah, so on that note, Tricia, do you think the public understands the trade-offs that come with this emergency? You're right about the narrative that, daily life won't be interrupted, that there's no military rule, there won't be a curfew, but understanding the trade-off of having parliamentary democracy suspended, can you walk us through how we should understand that? What are the governance issues, the check and balance issues, the transparency and accountability issues that concern you with this emergency proclamation?
What concerns me at this moment is the whole vaccination plan. So it is a very big amount of money that the government is spending. And more importantly, there are going to be a lot of different companies that are contracted to do the rollout and the implementation of COVID vaccines effectively. That some of the vaccines involve 2 different doses, and the planning of the 2 doses, it really depends very much on the company that's selected. And I would be very concerned that if the procurement practices that are not done in a transparent and rules-based manner, that Parliament is not there to provide that oversight. So essentially what you're saying is you're giving a green light to the executive to have the entire say over the matter, or this independent committee, which we don't know very much about, which ultimately I think does report to the Prime Minister. So you're actually giving the green light to very large, a huge public decision-making businesses of the next 8 months under one man and under the Prime Minister. And this is precisely what a parliamentary democracy is not supposed to be about. I will want to say that we welcome, I think the statement has by the Speaker says that the all-party parliamentary group and the various parliamentary select committees that have been formed, they will carry out their activities unless, of course, they're restricted by doing so by the ordinances or any of the ordinances issued in line with the emergency. So I welcome that, but I think ultimately those are just the committees. Ultimately, we do need that kind of parliamentary oversight because the executive, as we know it, is already strong.
Tricia, there's some interesting elements in the proclamation which included that advisory committee that's supposed to help perhaps the monarch make a decision about ending the emergency sooner. But the question of its constitution, the question of its actually legal basis, and whether it's going to be a kind of fig leaf on what is in some quarters seen as a kind of power grab that will be in fact unable to contain what is unleashed, which is total executive dominance at this point in time.
Yes, so I think even prior to this, we have to take note of all the various executive committees or councils that are actually being formed and are making decisions in an unprecedented way that we have not really had in recent years, right? So the last year alone, we've had the National Security Council making a lot of decisions. In a way, like one could ask, do they actually replace the cabinet in the way decisions are being made. And then the second thing, of course, is that there's going to be this executive committee. So the number of committees and councils being set up, I mean, what does that do to the cabinet? So I know there are questions, separate questions altogether about the legitimacy of the government, which we're not even addressing today, right? So like, never mind that actually the members of parliament that have actually said they've withdrawn support. I think that's also something that really needs to be resolved. And I think that's, so there are two different things there. So number one, the concentration of power in the executive in the forms that are actually perhaps not constitutionally recognized. And second, of course, the very legitimacy of the government, which I think the abruptness of the announcement today, I mean, it does lend to that speculation, of course, that this decision is actually made for political reasons, because essentially we know elections cannot be held because of the pandemic, and the only other solution would have been a way through Parliament, either a confidence and supply agreement in the way that Perak was able to succeed, and the other alternative would have been a sort of either vote of confidence or no confidence, because the Constitution is quite clear. I think if there is a person who has lost the majority of Parliament support, it is quite clear as to what the route would be. So there are routes that should have been taken as alternatives, and this, unfortunately, was the option that was chosen.
Tricia, can I ask you very quickly, Tricia? Hi, Tricia. Sorry, very quickly, with the little time that we have left, I want to talk to you about the state legislative assemblies that were suspended. So it's not just parliamentary democracy at the state level as well. How are we reading the relationship between federal and state, not to forget the territories of Sabah and Sarawak?
Yes, I mean, this is something, as you know, I feel really strongly about. And I think if you look at the COVID map, and if the emergency is being announced as a public health reason, that one just needs to look at the COVID map, and we know that there are certain states that are not of great concern. I mean, I think the numbers are relatively low in states like Perlis. I haven't really checked all the others yet, but I know that some states are like redder than others, and therefore some states are greener than others. So in a way, you know, these legislative assemblies are also being suspended, and they should not necessarily be pulled into this when it is, I suppose, a national political crisis that's happening very much more at the center. So I think this is the time that state governments do need to start speaking up. I think the state government I'm not sure if it's a state government, but definitely there have been voices coming from the east, from Sarawak, that are asking, why the states there are being pulled into this national level emergency. And the Constitution is quite clear that under a national emergency, the executive powers within the federal government can actually intervene and make decisions on behalf of the state. So this is actually something that all states should legitimately call to question, and at least consultation could have also been done, I would say, in this instance.
Okay. Tricia, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate you joining us on the show tonight. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan, signing off from our living room.
Thank you so much for watching.